the one rule that all man, from the time they first were walking around looking up at the sun, scratching around for food and an animal to kill, the first concept that I feel got into their head was the idea of life and death.
If there ever were a filmmaker who truly went for it, I would have to give it up for Francis Ford Coppola, the Mad King who once ruled Hollywood. Considered one of the leading figures of New Hollywood and one of the greatest directors of all time, Coppola paved the way for a new style of filmmaking that inspired a generation of filmmakers to come. With films like Godfather Part 1 and 2, Apocalypse Now, The Conversation, and Bram Stoker's Dracula under his belt, this giant of cinema is of course the one destined to rule them all. But it wasn't always this way. Having grown up bedridden for large parts of his childhood due to contracting polio at a young age kept him indoors for a long time. But that didn't stop young Francis. He developed an interest in theater after reading A Streetcar Named Desire at age 15 and started creating 8mm feature films edited from home movies with titles such as The Rich Millionaire and The Lost Wallet. What a genius. Coppola studied under legendary boundary-pushing filmmaker Dorothy Asner, whose influence can be seen throughout not just Coppola's filmography but cinema in general. She deserves her own video. Later on, he used his childhood as an influence. Italia Coppola, who had to help Francis with his bath, had lowered him into hot water one day, only to leave the room for a brief period to answer the doorbell. Unable to stay seated in the tub, Francis began to slide downward in the water, which soon reached his nose. Italia returned at the last moment. The Conversation's protagonist, Harry Cole, had a similar experience in his youth, and he tells the story at one point during the movie. Coming back to Francis and his legendary unmatched run from 1972 to 1979, so how did he do it and what were its effects? Starting with the one film everyone knows about, The Godfather, Part 1. Universally recognized as one of the greatest adaptations of all time, The Godfather was not without its ups and downs. The infamous battle ensuing between Francis and the executives at Paramount was furious during production, so much so that the studio's executive did not trust him anymore, calling him young, inexperienced, and naive, and even calling him to be fired several times during the production of the film. Coppola was not happy with this experience, calling it an extremely nightmarish experience. The Godfather was a very unappreciated movie when we were making it. They were very unhappy with it. They didn't like the cast. They didn't like the way I was shooting it. I was always on the verge of getting fired. But Coppola fired on. He resisted his way till he could cast Marlon Brando and Al Pacino even after facing heavy pushback later on. The real issue always was the idea that the mafia was being glamorized and the idea of the romanticization of organized crime. The Godfather, being the cinematic masterpiece of all time, sparked debates over decades about the responsibility of the filmmaker and its influence throughout cinema. The film has become an abiding cultural touchstone that can be seen through many different lenses. A metaphor for US capitalism, a commentary on the American dream, and even a critique of the motion picture industry itself. Then we have the disastrous but beautiful Apocalypse Now. Chaos, severely over budget, shoot dragged over a year in the hot, humid Philippine jungle. Martin Sheen had a freaking heart attack on set. Marlon Brando, overweight. Coppola even mortgaged his house and put his entire career on the line to complete this masterpiece. He also personally gave me one of the best pieces of advice ever.
Nothing is so terrible as a pretentious movie. I mean, a movie that aspires for something really terrific and doesn't pull it off is shit, it's scum. And everyone will walk on it as such. And that's why poor filmmakers, in a way, that's their greatest horror, is to be pretentious. So here you are, on one hand, is trying to aspire to really do something. On the other hand, you're not allowed to be pretentious. And finally you say, fuck it. I don't care if I'm pretentious or not pretentious, or if I've done it or I haven't done it. All I know is that I am going to see this movie. And that for me, it has to have some answers. And by answers, I don't mean just a punchline. Answers on about 47 different levels.
Yup, back to the disaster. Coppola himself described the process of making this film as making a film about Vietnam while going through his own Vietnam. A typhoon destroyed much of the set. Coppola had an epileptic seizure. The helicopters he had rented from the Philippine government repeatedly disappeared to take part in actual combat, fighting an insurgency in the south of the country. The pilots were rarely the same from rehearsal to rehearsal, and the choppers had to be repainted twice a day to change their colors from American back to Filipino. And of course, Dennis Hopper stoned out of his mind. All of this, and still the Madman managed to pull through. Who's to say if he was ever the same after this? Beautifully stunning and filled with chilling themes as the film may be, the horror film production of Apocalypse Now parallels the same theme it set out to address. Coppola showed through these two films how far a person can go in the pursuit of his artistic endeavor.